All right, guys. Today, we're just continuing on with what you had been working on. We're going to kind of debrief the notes that you took over the last couple of days. Yesterday, we did a real brief overview of the Ottoman Empire and kind of what they were going through during this time period, trying to catch up with more of these industrialized nations. Today, we're going to focus exclusively on the Qing Dynasty, aka Manchu China. We're also going to be talking about Japan. I will discuss most of the stuff on this list, but we're not going to go over every single thing. So make sure that you've kind of done your reading, you've done your notes, because this is going to be a big part of our next notebook check. Other news and notes. There has been a pretty significant change for our essay. Originally, we were going to do the essay on Friday. That has been shifted to Monday. Every year, and you've been in this district long enough, or really any district, every year we have to collect essays from all of our kids at a certain point. That window opens up on Monday. So rather than, trying to squeeze another essay into the 6 weeks, which maybe we'll do, maybe we won't, I figured pushing it one day back would just be better for all of us. So kind of the game plan's still the same. I'm still toying with exactly what we're going to do on Friday. We may watch an episode of Mankind, the Story of All of Us that goes into a lot of this. So it'll actually be a pretty good review. But I'm still kind of tinkering with that. But the rest of the week will more or less be the same. Today we're finishing this up. Tomorrow we will still kind of review all the basics of LEQ writing. We'll go over the rubric. We'll look at some samples, stuff like that. And then on Friday, we'll kind of see, if nothing else, we'll kind of review some of the key things that you probably need to know for the essay, which you will then do in class on Monday. Other than that, just a couple reminders, late work, with the exception of the notebook check. Everything else is going to close on Friday. So please get that stuff in. And the extra credit, it is open in AP Classroom. You could get 14 points possibly added to your lowest test grade. So yeah, get that done. You just got to get it done in the time limit, the 30-minute time limit. But get that done. There's nothing to lose. There's only stuff to gain. Even if you don't do super great on the questions themselves, it's good experience. And yeah, it's something you could do relatively easily. But that is going to close at 11:45 Sunday night. So please get that done if you're interested before that. So one of the general themes that we're talking about right now is not everywhere industrialized, not everywhere modernized at the same time. You've got many of the countries of Western Europe. A little bit later, you've got the United States. That's about it in the beginning days. As we get into the early to mid 1800s, that's pretty much it. Some of our other prominent civilizations are trying to play catch up. We saw with the Ottomans, they did make reforms, but maybe it was too little too late. Today, we're going to see how different factors kind of, made the Chinese and the Japanese react in different ways to varying degrees of success. So first, let's talk about the Qing Dynasty, aka Manchu China, and all the stuff that ultimately kind of led to their downfall. This is the last Chinese dynasty after all. One of the things that people get confused by is the names. They are the Qing Dynasty, but sometimes they're also called the Manchu. Does anybody remember why they're called that? I know you're like, because we talked about it a while back, but they do mention it in the reading. Anybody know where the Manchu are from? Today it's a part of China, but back then it was kind of more on the outskirts. Because the Qing Dynasty, the ruling class, they're from Manchuria, which had more or less been to the very northernmost part of China. Ethnically, they're different from the majority of the population. And when you look at ethnicity, look at it this way, you've got all these different races, but then you've got, a lot of different types of white people, black people, Chinese people. It goes on and on and on. Well, not all Chinese are exactly the same. There are some distinct ethnicities there. And the Manchu were kind of a minor ethnicity. They came in, they took over from the Ming Dynasty, and they kind of asserted their control for, a little less than 300 years. I bring that up because they were always kind of seen as outsiders. Do y'all remember the crazy haircut that they made people get? That really ugly thing where they had like the ponytail, like almost like a top knot, but the rest of the head was shaved. That was something that they did, and they made people do to kind of make their cultural elements dominant. But really, our story goes back of how you get to all this stuff with the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty, as you may recall, early on in the days of the Ming, they were involved in some exploration. They sent that admiral Zheng He throughout the Indian Ocean, kind of collecting tributary payments, also just showing off the might of China. And a lot of that has to do with them trying to prove that they were that nickname that kind of describes how they viewed themselves. Does anybody remember that nickname that China had for most of their history? Not over here, not over here. Right here. Yeah, pretty much. The Middle Kingdom. Okay, write that down. That's going to be referenced a lot. Sometimes they may be talking about China in a primary source document, but they might not say China. They may say the Middle Kingdom because it was a nickname, similar to how the sick man of Europe at this point was a nickname for the Ottomans. Okay, sometimes nicknames are very telling. For the Ottomans, it tells you, hey, they were on their way downhill for a long time. For China, it tells you that they literally thought they were the center of the world. For years and years, everybody had come to them for all these luxury goods. They were technologically the most advanced. They had arguably the strongest economy out there. Really these voyages of Zheng He just kind of prove that. Well, after the voyages, the emperor that had sponsored those voyages died, there was a new sense of, hey, we've seen what all's out there. And everyone is still kind of beneath us. They're not as advanced as us. And there was a real fear that, letting too much contact with foreigners into China itself was going to some way diminish them. It was going to lower them. It was going to crush some of their traditional values. So starting with the Ming and kind of carrying over into the next final dynasty, the Qing dynasty, China starts to isolate itself. Okay, it's not that they're not trading, they are. It's not that they're not still doing well for themselves. They are, especially in the early days of the Qing dynasty, they're still making money hand over fist. They were still trading, even as, Europeans start directly showing up at their door, they were still trading. But in the early days with the Ming and later in the early days of the Qing, they pretty much refined trade to one spot. And this is a city you need to know, Canton, also called Guangzhou. Okay, so there's still people coming directly there. And at this point, it was meant mainly to limit, the rise of Europe, them coming in. They didn't want Europeans getting further and further into China itself. And things were going good for a little bit. The problem is, as time progressed, people like the British, now fully industrialized, now, having all this stuff to sell. I mean, China's got more people than anybody on earth, even at this point. So, the British and others are saying, hey, we want increased trading access. We want, the ability to sell our products. And the Chinese didn't really want anything they had to sell. Okay, they liked their silver because China didn't have a whole lot of that. They did like their silver, but as far as their products, the things that they had mass produced, there was no real interest there. Okay, and at this point, the British are getting strung out on a lot of Chinese goods. I mean, this is the time period where the British really embrace tea. And tea originates in China, although later, obviously, they grow it elsewhere. So the British are in a pickle, okay? They want to expand trade in China. They need to find something to get the Chinese into that they can provide. And finally, they find something. Does anybody out of the reading know what they start selling in China that makes them a lot of money, but ticks people off? Has to do with one of the first things you were supposed to take notes on. Opium. Does anybody know what opium is? Opium's a drug, all right? It's derived from the poppy plant. You've heard of drugs today being called opiates. Like, heroin is an opiate. Some of your very powerful pain medication that people get addicted to, like oxycodone and stuff like that, they're opiates. Well, opium is kind of the origins of that. And back then, it was highly addictive. People would smoke it, and they would, they would get high, I guess, akin to what a heroin addict would get today. And it started running rampant. Obviously, the Chinese government is upset. They tried to ban, this import, but the addiction had gotten too strong. And for the British, this was a big moneymaker. And that's what starts the first of a couple opium wars. Just think about how weird this is. The British went to war with China so they could keep dealing them drugs. History is really, really weird. Okay, and that opens the door to just about everything else that you were supposed to take notes over. We got our first video today, and it's all about the collapse of the Qing dynasty. And they're going to talk about some of the things that I've talked about. They're going to talk about a lot of the things that are in your notes. I'm going to pause it from time to time and elaborate, because some things they don't give you a whole lot of details on. They just kind of give you the big picture of how and why this is the last Chinese dynasty. I will forewarn you. And I looked for a couple videos, and I was choosing between a few different ones. I like this one because it gives a good overview of the external and internal factors that really led to this being the final Chinese dynasty. The problem is the narrator, he does have a pretty thick accent. Again, if you pay attention, there's no reason you can't understand what all he's saying. I would put up the closed captions, but I feel like sometimes there's mistakes in that and it might be confusing. So just pay attention, listen. I will stop it from time to time. We'll go back to your notes. We'll go back to the map, and I'll try to elaborate. Your only job right now is to add into the notes you have. If I mention something, if I say something that just makes a little bit more sense than what you read, by all means, guys, just add into your notes, aid in your understanding, because again, you got to understand how these different areas reacted to all the change that was going on in the West. Here we go. It's pretty good, but like I said,
a country with a rich past, was ruled by many dynasties across its history. The Chinese civilization was one of the greatest of the ancient world, and from that time on, until 1911, they were ruled by different families and groups. The Ming dynasty, or Great Ming, which ruled China for about 276 years, until 1644, was the last imperial dynasty of China, ruled by ethnic Han Chinese. After some rebellions and instability, the Manchurians under Qing started to rule China from 1644 to 1911. This will become the last imperial dynasty in the Chinese history. We can say that in this era of Qing, some very good things happened here. The population grew from 150 to 450 million. The integrated national economy was established, and in 1689 a treaty was concluded with Russia at Nerchinsk, establishing the northern extent of the Manchurian boundary at the Argon River. Over the next years, Mongols were defeated, and the empire was extended to Outer Mongolia, Tibet, Turkestan, and Nepal. In the 18th century, the economy flourished under the two succeeding emperors, Yongchang and Qianlong. Commerce and industries prospered and grew. Printing and porcelain manufacture flourished, and new technological and scientific methods were developed. Also, Catholic missionaries were tolerated, accepted, and employed in the empire. This decision was a good one for this empire. Instead, in Japan, Christianity was banned some centuries before. the Qing Empire appeared so orderly and prosperous in the 18th century that the French philosopher Voltaire praised the Chinese for having the most effectively organized government that the world has ever seen. The fall and collapse of Qing dynasty was caused by external and internal changes within and outside the dynasty. The next rulers, however, were unable to meet the problems caused by increased population pressure and concentration of land ownership. The Manchu armies deteriorated, and the situation was aggravated even more by severe floods and famine. Efforts for modernization and westernization met opposition from conservative officials. Bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption became widespread. The corruption, peasant unrest, population growth, the Western influence, and the new bad administrations were factors that led to the Taiping and Mian rebellions in the south and north against the Manchu regime.
Okay. So again, take a deep breath. I gotta pause every once in a while just because, again, the accent's pretty thick. But let me just kind of summarize. In the early days, things were going all right. Business was still booming, even though trade was more limited than it had been in the past, at least with, direct, access for Europeans. Things were going all right. But there's a few things that started to play the Qing in general. They are ethnic minorities. So again, they're a little bit different from the majority of the population. You do see, a series of droughts and later floods and crop failures and overpopulation. So maybe there's not enough to eat. What's that thing in Chinese history that emperors basically say, I have this so I can rule?
Divine right.
It's the exact same thing. It's hard to tell because, divine right. But it wasn't called that in China. It's the same thing. What was it? Yeah, the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven. And throughout China's history, that was the justification. Like, hey, we are chosen by the heavens, by the gods. If they want a new ruling family in power, they're going to send signs. All right? These are some of the signs. Now, it doesn't always happen just like that, but you can already see some issues. Okay, and when issues like that start to rise up, you get uprisings. And one of the most famous was the Taiping Rebellion. And they kind of go out of order here, but the Taiping Rebellion. Did anybody catch, because it's pretty interesting, did anybody catch who started the Taiping Rebellion? Like, he's got a specific name, but rather than remember his name, because I can't even remember his name, who did he claim to be? No ideas? Again, over the years, they had said that more and more Catholic missionaries were kind of making their way into China. Some people were cool with it. Some of the more conservatives were not. Okay. The guy who kind of started this uprising, and again, it was easy to get people riled up because of some of these issues, because foreigners had kind of been more influential in China. The guy that started the Taiping Rebellion claimed to be Jesus's little brother. Yes, he claimed to be Jesus's little brother. He was a Christian convert. He had tried to get jobs, with the Qing government, and it failed. And he was obviously mentally unstable. But enough stuff, bless you, had been going on that he does get people riled up. And it starts this massive peasant uprising where essentially this guy, who again claims to be Jesus' little brother, his goal is to convert all of China to Christianity. He wants it to be this new Christian kingdom. And to put down the uprising, really foreign powers, which were already there, they had to help out. They had to help out the Qing government, people like the French, people like the British. Well, now all of a sudden, not only, are the leaders of the government, the Qing, who weren't super well liked anyway, not only are they now, killing their own people, but they're also using foreigners to come in and do it for them. Guys, this was massive. 20 million people died. 20 million. That's one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. And granted, it went over, I think I wrote down the dates. You're looking at quite a long time, over a 10-year period, but still, The government now is kind of seen as weak. They're kind of seen as in cahoots with some foreign powers. Discontent is rising. The Taiping Rebellion, though, actually came after what they're going to talk about next, the Opium Wars. Because the Opium Wars, guys, that's what really opened the floodgates to an awful lot of discontent.
One good reason is that the majority of Chinese population were Han Chinese, and they never fully accepted the Qing rule. A trade imbalance happened here. Great Britain was a very powerful colonial empire, widespread across the globe. For them and for other Europeans, trade was very important for their local economies. They always trying to find new valuable things and new cultures. But when the country you need goods from does not really need to trade goods with you, some problems could happen. This is what happened between Great Britain and Qing dynasty. There was a high demand for China's tea in Great Britain and in Europe, but a low demand for Britain's good in China. Great Britain was in debt to China, and they had to do something about it to get out. As a result, they started to sell silver to make the imbalance better. Silver wasn't so important for the Chinese, so Great Britain was still behind in payments. When selling silver did not work, they began selling opium, which is a plant grown in India, smoked from a pipe. Chinese people became quickly addicted to this drug and traded the silver originally from Great Britain to get opium. China tried to make new restrictions against foreign merchants and ships, and Great Britain did not like this idea and fought back, resulting in the Opium War. Of course, Britain came out on top because they had better artillery, forcing China to sign the Treaty of Nanjing. This was only the beginning of the Western influence in China, because now more ports were opened, all trade was put under European control, causing more Western ideas and cultures to spread into China. The First Opium War revealed the outdated state of the Chinese military. The Qing Navy, composed entirely of wooden sailing ships, and was severely outclassed by the modern tactics and firepower of the British Royal Navy. The British technology easily outmaneuvered and outgunned Qing forces in ground battles. The Qing surrendered in 1842. This war showed to the Western world that a big Chinese empire has some weak spots. Their defeat attracted more attention. The Western powers became largely unsatisfied with the Treaty of Nanjing, and then China's income fell sharply during the wars. As vast areas of farmland were destroyed, millions of lives were lost, and countless armies were raised and equipped to fight rebellions. Britain tried to renegotiate the Treaty of Nanjing, inserting clauses allowing British commercial access to Chinese rivers and the creation of a permanent British embassy at Beijing. Due to the failure of the treaty to satisfy British goals of improved trade and diplomatic relations, and because of an incident with a ship, the Second Opium War started. The British and the French joined forces in the Second War, and together they attacked and occupied Canton in late 1857. The United States was involved in a minor conflict during this war. They ignored the UK's offer of alliance and did not coordinate with Anglo-French forces. The US Navy participated in the Battle of Pearl River Forts, and the ships bombarded and attacked the river forts near Canton. After some diplomatic efforts, the American and Chinese government signed an agreement for US neutrality. Completely unprepared for such a war, the Qing dynasty lost, and Britain imposed unequal treaties and took control of millions of pounds of silver to compensate for the British loss of opium. This humiliation showed all of China's subjects, neighbors, and tributary states that once mighty China was now weak and vulnerable. The Unequal Treaties is the name given by the Chinese to a series of treaties signed with Western powers during the 19th and the 20th centuries by Qing dynasty. In this time, China suffered military defeats and loss of power. The Treaty of Aachen of 1858 was an unequal treaty between the Russian Empire and the Empire of Qing, in which Russians get some lands in Manchuria, the Convention of Peking. This was a great blow for the Qing states. The First Convention of Peking, sometimes known as the Convention of Beijing, is an agreement comprising three distinct treaties, concluding between the Qing dynasty of China and the United Kingdom French Empire and Russian Empire in 1860. After this treaty, China will be humiliated. Some of the articles of the treaty say that Hong Kong area will be given to United Kingdom, and more land for Manchuria will be given to Russian Empire, and the Europeans will have a larger influence in this territory. The Dungan Rebels happened.
Okay, let's look at this real quick, because this all ties back to what we have been talking. So the Opium Wars go down. And there's more than one. There's two. And ultimately the British are successful. So just think about how weird this is. You don't want us to sell you drugs? To heck with you. We're going to sell you. We're going to fight you so we can sell you drugs and other stuff. And because China was not industrialized, even though for what they were advanced. They were not at the same level as Great Britain at this point. Even though Great Britain is tiny and China is huge, the British win those wars pretty easily. So now they've got some leverage over the Chinese, and they sign all these treaties, expanding the port cities and the rivers and the places that people like the British and later other Europeans can go. They actually give the British a colony that was a part of China, Hong Kong, which Hong Kong will be a British possession all the way up until the late 1990s. So it was 100 some odd years, I think. It was like a lease. And today, you see in the news all the time, beef between China and Hong Kong. Even though Hong Kong is technically a part of China, culturally, it's a lot more British, because again, that's 100 years of British rule. So they've got that for their possession. And what you see over the years that follow is based on this expansion of access to trade, you start to see China carved up into spheres of influence. All a sphere of influence is, and we'll talk about it later in a different context, but there are specific areas in which, due to treaties, European countries have a lot of power. They not only have trade privileges, but because over the years so many Chinese have come to depend on them, they almost are acting in a way where economically they're the puppet masters. They kind of have control. And from that point onwards, China is weakened. The central government out of Beijing is weakened. They don't have the respect of the people because foreigners are coming in. A lot of them have extraterritoriality, which we talked about yesterday, and discontent's just rising. Okay, that's one of the reasons the Taiping Rebellion, which Jesus' little brother, happened, because the video is kind of out of order. The Opium Wars come first, Taiping Rebellion comes next, and then more stuff just keeps on happening. We do have the self-strengthening movement where China's trying to become less dependent on foreign powers. They're trying to modernize a little bit on their own, but much like Tanzimat, maybe it's a little too late, so to speak. Got just a little bit more of this one. What?
China.
No, we ain't doing that. I think we're at 7:55. There we go. We'll start right there.
Will have a larger influence in this territory. The Dungan Rebels happened. This was a mainly ethnic and religious war, and it caused millions of deaths. The first Sino-Japanese War started in 1894 and was fought between Qing Dynasty of China and the Empire of Japan, primarily for the influence over Korea. Again, a massive defeat for the Chinese. Spheres of influence started to exist here. Some European powers used some events as pretext to gain control of some areas. The imperialist design of European powers and the instability of Qing government created conditions that led to the emergence of the Boxers. In 1900, local groups of Boxers proclaimed support for the Qing dynasty and killed foreign missionaries and large numbers of Chinese Christians. Then a coalition of European, Japanese, and Russian armies, known as the Eight-Nation Alliance, entered China without any diplomatic notice, much less permission. After a short but hard-fought campaign, Beijing was occupied. Victorious allies drew up scores and demands on Qing government, including compensation for their expenses in invading China and execution of complicit officials.
Okay, so last little pause for this. You got the Boxer Rebellion. So things have been going on for years, and Europeans have been present in China and have been pulling the string. And China, they were the middle kingdom. You know, they're very resentful, especially some of the conservative forces, which at this point, the ruler of China was certainly conservative. She kind of resented all this European influence and supposedly secretly supported this group, the Boxers, or as they called themselves, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. These are kung fu fighters. Just imagine how crazy this is. These are martial artists who would go to the streets and they would find European missionaries, Christians, just foreigners in general, and they would beat the crap out of them. That's what starts this, okay? I mean, it's literally like street fighting. You know, they're going out there, they're beating people up, trying to drive foreigners out of the country, essentially, trying to lessen their influence. Because again, people were upset. All these different foreign nations, they invade. They take out the Boxers, even though the Qing government kind of sort of supported the Boxers. And then they tell the Qing, well, now you owe us all this money for us having to come here and do your business. Plus, you're going to give us even more privileges. And that really is the beginning of the end. Again, if they hadn't lost the mandate of heaven at that point, they certainly, it wasn't going to take much to do that. And what you see is we get into the early 20th century is the Qing dynasty falls apart. You see a republic take over, which really doesn't have a whole lot of power because China at this point is very fragmented. And you don't really get what you see as modern China, the People's Republic of China, until after World War II. From the early 20th century all the way to the middle of the 20th century, it's pretty chaotic. And we're going to get into that more later when we do World War I and World War II. But just know, I mean, with all these different things, these external and internal factors, I mean, the Qing were kind of doomed to fail.
After the Boxer Rebellion, the Qing dynasty tried to reform itself to please both Chinese people and other nations. But despite its efforts, for others the dynasty needed to be replaced. Sun Yat-sen formed the revived China Society. In 1905, a convention was held in order to unite the radical groups of China to overthrow Qing. These groups will become the Nationalist Party of China, which will embrace nationalism, democracy, and freedom. In 1908, the Empress of Qing died, and just an infant heir existed. With lack of stability, the government was overthrown and legally banned. But new problems will rise for the Chinese from now on.
Again, it wasn't just one thing, it was a variety of things. But after a few years, considering they already weren't super well liked, considering you had all this foreign influence that people resented, you had a lack of modernization, so they couldn't stand up to the foreigners. The people rose up, the government was overthrown, and for the next 20, 30, 40 years, a lot of instability. Yes, sir. Go ahead. We're now moving on to Japan, which, similar to China, but even more so, had become very isolated since Europeans started showing up in the 1600s. By the time we get to the mid-1800s, I mean, Japan is still operating under that old school feudal system, with a shogun and samurai and all that. That's until the United States shows up with Commodore Matthew Perry. And he's the guy that basically says, you will open your doors, you will trade with us, and that gets everything else rolling. Okay, this is a little bit after the Opium Wars. So Japan starts looking and seeing what happened to China, and they say, hey, that ain't gonna happen to us. So during the Meiji era, the Meiji Restoration, the emperor is restored to power, theoretically, and he's going to kind of initiate state-sponsored industrialization. That way they don't get pushed around like China did. They become fully industrialized. And soon, they're going to start some empire building of their own to get resources, which is a trend you're going to see them continue through World War I and World War II. Remember, we fight against them in World War II in large part because they were taking over so much territory. When you hear the Meiji era, think, man, that is when Japan starts to industrialize, when they get modernized. Now, our last video, it is a crash course, but I think at this point you'll be thankful because you probably are going to have an easier time understanding what John Green says. The first video is a good review of what we've been talking about for the last couple weeks in nationalism. Because remember, nationalism is sweeping across the globe during this time period. Japanese nationalism was like, hey, have to have this pride in our nation. That way we don't get taken over by foreign powers, essentially like China did. So they're going to talk about nationalism. They're going to mention some of the people and places that you've read about. The second part is just over Japan. And they're going to kind of tell how they modernize and how they become an industrial power themselves. Because remember, by the time you get to the 20th century, it's mainly Western European nations that are really industrialized. It's the United States, and we also said it's Japan. This will tell you how. I won't pause this one a whole lot because we'll run out of time, but just kind of watch it, pay attention, kind of add to your understanding what you already have in your notes.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about nationalism, the most important global phenomenon of the 19th century, and also the phenomenon responsible for one of the most commented upon aspects of Crash Course, my gloves being out of date.